males of any age, he said, need to be in the presence of other men in order to hear the sound that male cells sing. It just gave me chills when I first heard it. The
Mm.
sound that male cells sing. And what it spoke to me then and still does is that just being in the presence of a group of guys who are there to be real,
Hmm.
to open their hearts, open their minds, to be vulnerable, it also tunes us into something that many of us hunger for
Hmm.
that we never had enough of.
Welcome to the Father, Sons, Brothers podcast, where we talk about topics related to integrated leadership and support men to live lives of passion and purpose. My name's Gareth, and thank you for spending some time with us today. It's a really, really special episode because I'm speaking to somebody who has been in the men's workspace for almost half a century. Jed Diamond is a relationship specialist. He is one of the world's leading experts in gender medicine and men's health. He specializes in working with men and their families, focusing on issues of mental, emotional, and relational health. He's written 17 books, including international bestsellers called Surviving Male Menopause and The Irritable Male Syndrome. That's a topic that we get into in this podcast. His most recent book is called Long Live Men, The Moonshot and Mission to Heal Men, Close the Lifespan Gap, and Offer Hope to Humanity, which was published in 2023. Jed and I dived into a really beautiful, beautiful conversation around so many issues that are prevalent for men in the world today and themes that have been in the masculinity line for almost 50 years. As I feel like a bit of a newbie and a rookie to this space, it was really beautiful to be having a conversation with somebody that's been walking this path for so long. And Jed shares many of his experiences, and some of the topics that we got into that were particularly interesting was this universal core wound that affects most men, and then shared something with me that I didn't realize as well, and that is that this core wound actually affects the women in our lives as well. In this episode, we talk about what that is and how to integrate it, and when you do that, you come into greater alignment and greater sovereignty with yourself, and you're able to hold a space for the women in your life who might be holding the same core wound. Jed spoke about something really dear to my heart, which is the theme of collaboration over competition. And when you recognize that it's easier, faster, and more fun to collaborate with people in your life rather than walking it alone, call it the lone wolf mentality, you recognize that things are so much easier and things get done so much quicker. And a lot of men in the world are stuck in this paradigm of having to do it all on their own. If that feels like a theme in your life, you're going to get a huge amount of benefit out of listening to the section where Jed and I talk specifically over collaboration over competition and why even the word lone wolf is complete bullshit. Jed says there's no such thing as a lone wolf. We made that term up to justify the choices that we make to do things alone. But in nature, wolves live in packs. There's no such thing as a lone wolf. We also spoke about how men can hold space for their partners who might be going through perimenopause or in the phase of menopause. Jed's been through 2, I think even 3 relationships where he supported his partner going through menopause. He also then spoke about male menopause, which is a topic that's really not spoken about much at all. And it affects quite a high percentage of men in their sort of mid-40s and is very similar to the female version of menopause. And so if that feels like something that you might be dancing with or perhaps know nothing about, make sure you check out that section. And then we also spoke about this theme of recognizing the various elements in your life and how to understand which of the best elements to focus on. Meaning, as men, we often have so many things that we're working on: our projects, our money, our health, our families, our children, our bodies, all of those different elements. And how do we know which are the ones that we should be focusing on from one moment to next? Jed is such a beautiful analogy of understanding how these different threads of our lives weave together. And when I asked him which one to focus on, he had a really beautiful explanation to that. So if you feel like you're dancing with multiple elements in your life, lots of things on the go, I call them browser tabs, lots of browser tabs open in your world, He gives you a really beautiful explanation of how to understand which one to focus on. Jed has been a almost a forefather in the men's work movement, and he first kicked off and started a men's group in the 1960s. And he shares that his men's group has been a pillar for him to navigate his life and to build the successful businesses, the successful family, and the successful relationships that he's had. If you're new to men's work and you're listening to this episode for the first time, I really want to just let you know that our mission at Fathers, Sons, Brothers is to connect more men with this technology of men's work. And 10 years ago, if you told me about joining a men's group, I would have thought, that sounds like a support group for losers, or some sort of like maybe Alcoholics Anonymous where you show up and everyone cries on one another. Let me share with you that the men's group that I've been part of and the technology of men's work has supported me in my journey so much. I don't think there's another medicine that has been as supportive for me to help me move through some of the challenges that I was holding in my life, battling addiction, battling a lack of purpose and meaning in my life, not understanding how to be able to show up for relationships. Men's work has been such a powerful part of my journey. And as you'll hear in this episode, it has been for Jed as well. If you want to experience men's work in a safe, free experience, I'm going to paste a link in the show notes of this episode where you get the opportunity to come and check out the King Circle. This is a free 2-hour men's circle that happens on the last Sunday of every month. And we accept men of all ages, stages, races, all over the world to show up and sit in a circle and really tackle difficult topics that perhaps we don't have a space to genuinely talk about in our society and our culture. Each circle, we tackle a different topic. There's going to be an opportunity for you to engage with other men and to move through some of these conversations and themes in your life. You're going to leave that 2-hour experience a very different person to the one that arrived. So, without further ado, Mr. Jed Diamond. I am here with Jed Diamond. Welcome to the Father, Sons, Brothers podcast. Thanks for showing up today.
Yeah, it's good to be with you.
Thank you. I was sitting at breakfast with a friend of mine this morning, and he's been in Peru for about 3 or 4 years now, and he's been studying with a couple of teachers, plant teachers, like he's been working with tobacco and with ayahuasca. And I said to him, when are you planning to share your own magic, like to start facilitating your own work? And he's like, I don't know. There's always somebody further ahead down the path than me. And I said, yeah, that feels about right. And so as I start my journey into men's work and supporting men and just sharing the technology of men's work that supported me so much, in some ways, where I'm from, South Africa, this is still sort of a new field. And so I feel like I'm kind of a pioneer in the work that I'm doing. And then I meet you, sir, and you've been in this game for 50 years, and there's definitely feels like you're very much further down this path than me. So thank you so much for showing up. Maybe you can introduce yourself to this audience through one of these lenses. I know you have a couple. We spoke just before we pressed record
Yeah.
around the intergenerational components, but the Fathers, Sons, Brothers theme of this podcast, maybe share one of your roles that you've played either as a father or a son and brother.
Yeah. Well, the way I kind of uh, got into the field was the day my first son was born, which was November 21st, 1969. And as I held him in my arms for the first time, I made a promise to him that I would be a different kind of father than my father was able to be for me, and to do everything I could to create a world where men were fully healed and fully involved with their families throughout their lives. And then 2.5 years later, my wife, when we were in college, we had said, given the state of the world and the overcrowding, that we, when you're young and in love, you make promises, and some of them you actually keep. And one of ours was we said we would have a child and then we would adopt a child. And so after our first son was born, we started the adoption process and adopted an African American baby named Angela, who was born on March 22nd, 1972. And so that was the beginning of our family. And as I said, we've now have a fairly large family of 6 grown children, 17 grandchildren, and 4 great grandchildren. And the work that I've been doing with men is really in a very simple way to fulfill the promise I made to my first son when I held him, that I would be a
Mm.
different kind of father than my father was able to be for me, and to help other families and fathers and sons and grandsons and granddaughters and the whole multi generations to be as fully healthy as we can be.
So beautiful. What was the relationship like that you had with your dad that you felt that it needed to shift? How would you describe that experience of being a son to your father?
Yeah, well, that started for me when I was 5 years old, and my midlife father, he was in his uh, early 40s at the time, and he'd become increasingly stressed and depressed because he couldn't support his family doing the work that he loved to do. And he was kind of what we would call in modern time a progressive or even a radical, and felt the systems needed to change. And um, he got blacklisted in the United States during the time when, if you were left wing, you were accused of being a communist. And then there was an era that some may be aware of in the United States where progressives were blacklisted and then couldn't work in the movie industry. And he was a writer and a playwright. And so when I was 5 years old, he took an overdose of sleeping pills in his feeling of hopelessness. And luckily, he didn't die, um, but he was hospitalized in a mental hospital, which actually made the problem worse.
Wow.
And I grew up, I visited him with my uncle every day for a year between the time I was 5 and 6 years old, until he didn't recognize me anymore. He didn't know who I was. And uh, I grew up, feeling like somehow I needed to help my father, and also afraid that whatever happened to him would happen to me. And so, in some ways, I had new business cards written that said, Jed Diamond, PhD, LCSW, um, helping men and the families that love them since 1969, which was when my son was born. And I realized, actually I've been doing this work since 1949, when I was 5 years old, and I actually started trying to help my father and my mother. So I've actually, started very early in this work. But that's kind of a little thumbnail, a little story about the multi generations of my father and my son. I actually wrote a book called "My Distant Dad: Healing the Family Father Wound," where I talk about our healing, mutual healing journey.
Wow. There's so much there that we can branch into. What comes up for me, which is a theme of why we've called our podcast and our men's work brand Fathers, Sons, Brothers, for me has really been this recognition that it's some way the more nuclear modern family has disconnected us from intergenerational wisdom that exists, between father and son, and grandkids and their grandparents, specifically nine men, grandkids and their grandfathers. How do you see that as a challenge, and how do we potentially overcome that? That seems to be a topic in your work, that intergenerational sort of wisdom that's passed through the
Yeah.
ancestral line. I'd love to hear some of your thinking around that.
Well, part of it is, again, another part of my story, which was, um, I grew up without a father in the home, and thought mistakenly, as so many of us do, that, well, I grew up really fast. I had to take care of myself young. My mother had to work. I didn't have any biological brothers or sisters, so I was an only child, and kind of figured out I had to take care of myself a lot, and grew up. And as you do, you fall in love and you have a relationship. And I fell in love, got married, had the two children I described. But what I've now come to see is often the wounds from our childhood impact our adult relationships. So that marriage ended, and I remarried a second time, and that marriage ended. And
Uh-huh.
if you go to my website,
This was my next
you
question.
you see my little intro video on Men Alive that says "Confessions of a Twice Divorced Marriage Counselor."
Yeah.
Luckily, I kind of did my own, getting help, getting therapy, and figuring out like what I was missing, even as a therapist, that was getting in the way of being successful. And uh, met Carlin. We've been now together for 45 years. And one of the things she will tell you, which ties into your question, is the reason we've had a successful 45-year marriage is because I've been in a men's group that's been meeting for 46 years.
Wow.
And this men's group that started 46 years ago were and became my brothers that I never had. And
Mm.
so this men's group now, four of the seven of us that started out together 46 years ago have died. So they're in the next world, or whatever that place that we go. And I believe that there is some place our energy lives.
Yeah.
And there's still three of us, that three brothers in that way, that I still meet with, and we have our own children and grandchildren and so on. So that's another multi generational part of the journey that we are both learning from each other, passing on to each other, and part of, I think, the men's work that all of us are doing that are on this path.
Wow, that's so beautiful. So how fresh was the idea of being in a men's group when you started this 46 years ago? There's not a lot of men's work happening. There's no internet at that time. Is it just a natural coming together, or was it a sort of an awakening around this men's work technology? How did that come into your world? What made you decide to get into a men's group?
Well, back then, where the energy for groups was happening was with women. And my first wife and I, she was very involved in the emerging feminist movement in the 1960s and 70s. And we attended a large gathering of mostly women, but it was open to men. They invited, a man can come to this. It was a kind of a healing retreat, probably three or 400 people. And my wife had been in a women's group, and I was saying, God, where's for me? I need something, and I had no idea where. So I thought, well, maybe I'll meet some guys because it's open to guys. There are guys going to be there. And so there, like these four or 500, probably 12 guys maybe were there, and the
In
rest were
total.
women.
Wow.
And and so as part of they had an experiential kind of thing that they did at the beginning, where we were supposed to meet in a little group and talk about why you're here. And so, there were a few other guys that were there. The guys were told, you don't hang out with women, meet with, talk to some other guys. So there were, a few guys I talked to, and I said, so, why I was excited to hear, what their emotional experience. Were you scared like me? My God, all these women, what do we, and what these guys wanted to do is talk about sports and how cute that one was, and which was fine. I mean, I love that kind of, men talk,
Uh-huh.
but it wasn't what I was looking for, and I felt disappointed. And so I shared that later with some of the women that I had, met, and they were encouraging to me. They said, "Don't give up," because the few guys you talked to may have been uncomfortable and they didn't open up. You need to go start your own men's group. And so I did that. I When I got back home, I reached out to a friend, a buddy, and said, I feel like I'd like to start a men's group. And so we did. We started a group of guys that started meeting to talk more personally about our lives and what was going on. And that group lasted for about 3 or 4 years until I moved out of the area. And then the group that I'm now with, that's 46 years old. But I really attribute women to having been there for me and encouraged me at a time when I one didn't feel a lot of support, didn't even know where to look, and some very kind. And I got to say, they weren't all kind at that meeting. There were a fair number of feminist women then and still now that are not very supportive of men and often feel men are the cause of their problems. But there are
Mm.
also a lot of very supportive women then and now that really encourage and support men to meet with other guys, and that was kind of how it got started for me.
So good. I also just want to reflect, you're really beautiful to interview you. You're so good at bringing the points and then ending. Sometimes you interview people who can just carry on, and I just want to share that. Yeah, I can see you've done a lot of these interviews, so thank you. So, brother, I just want to ask you a question. So, somebody who's listening to this who perhaps hasn't been in a men's group before, what could they expect? Like, what's the medicine that you've received? Like, we've seen the outcome of it, but a lot of people think, perhaps going to a men's group is like, men just sitting around crying, or, some sort of. What I've noticed is perhaps men that haven't been exposed to this, and definitely my story as well from the world I came from. It was like, oh, if you're in a men's group, then you have like Alcoholics Anonymous. You've got some challenges, or there's like some stigma attached to it that there's something wrong if you're in it. So what have you learned as a function of being in these groups? I heard you say it supported your marriage, but what could somebody expect if they're listening to this and they've never been to a men's group before? What's some of the medicine that you've received?
Well, one of my longtime kind of allies, brothers in the men's work, and who'd been doing this work a long time, is a guy named Robert Bly, who written a number of books and had done podcasts, and a very interesting guy. And he and I attended together a number of men's gatherings. And one of the things he said, of many, many, a very wise man, and poet and writer, and one of the things he said, that males, he was talking about young men, but males of any age, he said, need to be in the presence of other men in order to hear the sound that male cells sing. And I thought that was such a wonderful, it just gave me chills when I first heard it. The
Mm.
sound that male cells sing. And what it spoke to me then and still does is that just being in the presence of a group of guys who are there to be real,
Mm-hmm.
to open their hearts, open their minds, to be vulnerable, it also tunes us into something that many of us hunger for,
Mm-hmm.
that we never had enough of, whether it was this connections with our fathers, or
Mm-hmm.
connections with brothers, or connections with friends. So the first element I've experienced in men's group is just feeling that excitement of being with other men, and feeling this almost vibration of energies. And then the simple but profound then is when you're with men who are willing to be real, willing to be vulnerable, willing to be open. And that's a process. I mean, it doesn't happen, it when my men's group 46 years ago first started, we talked about the things that were troubling us at the time, our relationships. I'm having
Right.
trouble with my relationship. Some were having trouble with drugs. Some were having trouble with just loneliness. I just don't have any friends. Some were having stresses at work. So initially we talked about problems,
Mm-hmm.
but as time went on, we talked about other things, including who we were, what we were dealing with, and the interactions with each other.
Mm. So, having worked with, I think you said 40,000 men at this stage across your career, can you share some of the themes that you see coming up that perhaps are, maybe consistent in the collective or collective in our wounding? Like, what are some particular themes that you notice through your work, having worked with so many men? Like, that's a really big data size. When you give themes here, I think it would probably be
Yeah.
relevant across generations and across culture and geography. So, I'd love to hear some of those.
Yeah. Well, I think one of the things, and again, I just if you knew me and you're starting to know me, part of the way in which I work through my own issues and find then maybe other people would be interested in some of what I learned is I write articles and books. So I write an article every week that I post on Men Alive, and I've written 17 books.
Amazing.
And one of the books that I think is kind of speaks to that question of what seems to be somewhat universal or common among men these days, then and now, is I wrote a book called My Distant Dad Healing the Family Father Wound.
Yeah.
And I think so many of us have a wound. Some spoke of it as a hole in the soul in the shape of our father, because most of us, I found, have father issues. In my case, I described kind of my, fairly severe father absence. But others have fathers that were just not there emotionally because they grew up being taught you got to be tough, you got to be strong, you can't let your feelings out. So I think we all have feelings where we needed more fathering, or we had brothers that were less than supportive, may have been abusive, may have been in conflict, may have been bullying. We have friends that we didn't get enough support. So being able to heal the father wound that so many of us have. And I might add, and I didn't know this until I actually completed my book, and I was looking for the last chapter, and I realized that there is a father wound I never knew I had, which was the wound that the women in my life had because they had lost fathers. My
Mm.
mother had lost her father when she was young, and that impacted all of her relationships. My
Mm.
first wife had her father died when she was young. Many of the women in our lives, those of us that are, have women in our lives, also have father wounds. So healing the father wound, I think, is one of the universal, almost universal processes that I think needs to happen and often can happen in men's groups.
How do we do it? What's the way to be able to heal it? What's the
One is
yeah
recognizing that it's there. So
awareness?
often it took a while in our group for us to start talking about our fathers. We were more wanting to talk about our wives or our lovers or our friends or our relationships or our work. But gradually, we got talking about our mothers, our fathers, and finding that we often had father things to talk about. Some of us still had fathers alive, which I did, and I was able to, through the group, help me actually engage my father in some new ways. So it really, the magic sauce or the magic is a willingness to be in community. And my wife and I are in a number of communities of men and women, and a men's group. She's in a number of women's groups, but communities where we can get real with each other. We can have a safe space where we can feel that we can trust to open ourselves up more deeply,
Yeah.
and a place where we can all heal together.
Hmm. You've also said somewhere, I think it was in one of your articles, the way that men and women tend to act out their pain. I'd love you to speak through those differences and how you see that as a way to be able to be perhaps a red flag that there's some healing to do.
Yeah, well, what I found in my life and in the life of a lot of men is we act out our pain. My depression, which I have suffered a lot in my life, it came out in the form of irritability and anger and frustration and acting out in various ways through drugs or alcohol or aggression or violence in some ways, all of which I've, have unfortunately had experienced in my own life. And and I actually developed a scale of how men often deal with their pain and suffering. of we act it out in many ways. Women as a group, and these are generalizations, not all men and not all women, but
Yeah.
men often act out our pain, and women often act in. They turn it inside. They blame themselves, they suffer themselves. And a comedian, a woman named Elaine Boozler, kind of summed it up, I thought, in a humorous way. She said, when women get depressed, they eat or go shopping. Men invade another country. It's a whole different way of thinking.
Hmm.
So men
Yeah.
act out in some ways, women act in, is one of the kind of summary of a lot of life experience that I've had in
Mm.
my work with people.
Thank you for your honesty around the depression and some of the areas that you've danced with this pain in your own life. I appreciate that. You said you had a scale. Does that mean it like some way of measuring it? Is that a modality that you have? What did you mean by a scale?
Yeah, I actually developed. I'm happy to share it with anybody that emails me. I have a depression scale that looks at the characteristics of male type depression and female type depression, and it's a way that I found, particularly for men, because I think a lot of in the work that I do as a clinician, I see a lot of men who are angry, depressed, but they're not treated for their pain. They're either told they're just grouchy old men and you go away,
Hmm.
or they push people away. And so I've developed a scale that helps, I think, clinicians and also the average person who may be married to somebody or in relationship with somebody who may have these symptoms and needs help but doesn't know it. So yeah, I have a number of scales that I share with people in my work, and happy to share it with people who either email me or go to my website. You can get some of those as well there.
Beautiful. I'll definitely put those in the show notes to support and share people. What do you see as themes for depression for men? I mean, the fatherhood wound seems to be one of those collective challenges, but what do you see in your work with as themes with men around depression? What are they depressed about? What's the way through for them? I mean, with men's groups we've spoken about, but what else? What are some of the themes that are causing this almost a pandemic of depression in men?
Yeah, well, I think part of it, is I've been both alive a long time. As I told you, I'm 81 years old, and what I'm seeing in the world, and had some life experience that have helped me understand some of these things, is that the world is not in good shape. The human relationship to the environment is not in balance, and I think this goes back maybe 6,000 years, a long time, where humans kind of got this notion when we started building big cities that somehow humans could dominate and control the environment, and
Hmm.
we were in charge. We were the top dog. And I think that mentality, that way of being, is we call civilization, but it's really I call it the dominator culture. My colleague Rianne Eisler, who wrote The Chalice and the Blade, talks about
Ah.
the dominator culture versus partnership cultures. And for, 2 million or 3 million years, humanity lived in partnership with nature and were what we call hunter gatherers. And then there was a time about 6,000 years ago where that shifted. So I think the disconnection from the earth then caused disconnection from ourselves and disconnection from others. And that, I think, is the root of both the depression, that we act out violently and
Hmm.
that we act in violently on ourselves. And so the healing that has to happen is healing our connection to ourselves. So there's inner work that we do through therapy or through groups. There's relational work, healing our relationship with each other, with our intimate partnerships, healing relationships with our friends, our family, our brothers, our sisters, and
Yeah.
then healing our relationship with the environment that we live in and finding a balance with nature rather than exploiting. I'm in California right now. It's pouring rain. They're calling it the atmospheric rivers that are just pouring through. And I think this this idea that we're somehow here to control nature, I think we're getting a wake up call all over that is saying, hey,
Hmm.
you people, meaning humanity, are a species that hadn't been here a long time compared to most other species. And if you don't get your act together and get back to connection with yourselves, each other, and the world, you're not going to be here very long. So all of that is, I think, the work that we have to do.
It's like nature's just self-regulating. If something doesn't live in harmony for long enough, it doesn't last for long enough. And if humanity doesn't sort this out, it does. The world will be here. The one thing I'm clear about is if we as humanity die on this planet, the world will be fine, probably better within a few years of us being gone. And so
Yeah.
I'm not worried about that. I'm more, yeah, feeling the collective grief of what you're speaking about, our disconnection with the world that we live in, and the domination culture is so strong. And I've experienced that. I've experienced that way of living and way of being in earlier years of my life, of just thinking, that the most important thing in the world was money, for example, and just putting so much focus on that, and yeah, almost unconscious of the cost of what that continual need for growth at all costs was. Jamie Wheel, I don't know if you followed his work, has this like analogy of, we've got unlimited growth targets in our businesses on a planet that's got finite resources. It just can't continue to expand internally. And I'd like to ask you how you unpacked those three elements. You spoke about inner work, and then healing our relationships with our relational elements in our lives, and then the world. Do you see those as like concentric circles, or do they support in that way, or is it just how you spoke about it?
Well, different. I mean, it's all connected, but to try to visualize it or to talk about it, to share it, sometimes I see it as concentric circles of healing that has to happen, um, and sometimes interrelated circles that have at their core a connection. And I think at least in the work that I do, um, I adapt it to the people that I work with. They're, they're different people have a need for a different model. Some people have more visual senses and need a more visual model. Other are more feeling. Other are more sensing. So there are different ways to express that. But I think the another way to that I find useful is that we have this work that we have to do on ourselves, our relationships and our intimate relationships, our relationship with our family, our relationship with our work in the world. And you might think of each one of those as a strand in. My wife is part Native American, and there's a Native American basket maker who makes these beautiful, baskets that have different strands and beautifully woven together. And what she described, I loved it. She says, if you think of the basket as your life, that there are many strands that you need to weave together to heal or to build a life, but you can only do one at a time. And what that allows for, and I think it's helped me in conceptualizing, is that there are times you need to focus on yourself, on your inner work. And that's the strand that needs to come next. But there are other strands. They're not there. So when you finish that, then there's a time for, oh, now it's time to address relationship with my wife. Oh, and now it's
Mm.
time for, getting my connection to nature and feeling grounded. Oh, now it's time for, my brother work. So what
Mm.
it allows
Beautiful.
for is to hold the reality that we have many strands to our lives, but that we can only do one of them at a time, and each will have its time. And we don't have to worry, oh my God, if I put in too much time with my work, then uh, my relationship's going to suffer.
Hmm.
And the problem is that we often, as you said, get hooked on one strand. We think, oh, work is the way that I'm going to solve all my problems or I'm going to make a good life. No,
Yeah.
that's one strand, and there's these others. So that was a helpful metaphor or vision that helped me hold these various strands in my own life.
How do you know which strand is next? Is it the one that's making the most noise, or how do you know which one you're working on?
Well, I think that's part of the gift of life. If we ask that question
Hmm.
of our inner truth, our deeper knowing, the God within, um, and we listen deeply, sometimes it just, oh, now I know this is needed. Sometimes it happens like when you have young children, they let you know that they're next. And,
Hmm.
the baby screams and you go, okay, I
That's it.
need to attend to the baby now.
Hmm.
Um, and sometimes that call is more quiet, and often we neglect sometimes that inner calling in us. We're so busy taking care of others, our families or the world's problems or whatever. We don't listen to that call that's saying, hey, you're needing some time for yourself.
Hmm.
You're needing to be quiet. You're needing to be in nature. You're needing to sleep. So I think part of the work that we all have is not only to do the work, but to find the balance of the various elements so that they work nicely together.
Hey, it's Gareth. I hope you're enjoying this conversation. The original definition of courage means from the heart, and I believe that we can have more courage in our lives by speaking from the heart. I'm on a mission to help heal the world by cultivating more courage, by having more conversations like the one you're listening to now, where I encourage my guests to speak from the heart. If that's a mission that you want to get behind and are prepared to support me on, it would really help us if you would share this podcast with somebody that you think would benefit from listening to this conversation, or sharing it onto social media and encouraging your network of people to engage with our guest and the message that we're cultivating here at this podcast. It will also support us if you subscribe to the podcast or write a review wherever you listen to podcasts. And in exchange for your support, you have my word that I will continue to seek out the most exciting, courageous, and inspiring people on the planet to keep cultivating more courage and having more conversations like the one you're listening to now. Thanks for stopping by. And now back to the show.
You have a lot of things happening in your world. You've written all of these books. You write an article every week. You're on multiple podcasts. You've helped 40,000 men. You're a busy human being. What is your personal practice to listen? You said that's an important component of it. What is your practice to cultivate a space to listen?
Well, one thing I walk every day in from my home, and part of my walk there's nature. Fortunately, there's nature everywhere, even in big cities. If you listen and you watch, there's birds, there's animals, there's nature is all around us. But
Yeah.
I also have some nature that is a little more natural, that's
Hmm.
not human made. Um, so I do that every day. And that's part of how I connect not only to the natural world, but to my little home environment. It's kind of like I walk the boundaries of my world, and I say hello to the people that are out there. I say hello to the animals. I say hello to the trees and the birds and the you know the elements, the rain, whatever is there. I do that every day. Um, I meditate every day. I take naps, not every day,
Beautiful.
but I listen to my body when it's time to just close my eyes. I do that. Um, right now, I'm taking care of my wife a lot. She's 86, and she's had some medical issues and had a stroke a few years ago. So at this stage of my life, I'm in a lot of caregiver mode. In addition to, there's times I write every day, and that's part of my work to the world. I see clients who see me both in my office as well as online from all over the world. So I have various pieces that feel, sometimes I feel overwhelmed. Sometimes it feels like there's more cries that I need to attend to. And at times I feel overwhelmed. But the long time practices, my men's group, a lot of the other things I've developed over many years that kind of give me the support I need when I need it is how I kind of deal with whatever is necessary, and recognizing I can only do one thing at a time, even though I also practice Aikido, which is a martial art where you learn to deal with various energies coming at you from different directions. And you learn that you actually can only deal with one at a time. But in Aikido and what they call the rondori, you do them very quickly sometimes, and you attend to the one at a time, and then one over here, and then one over here. And all, if you can and you learn over many years to stay centered and grounded while you're doing all that. So I'm still a student of life, as we all are. And I get off, I screw it up, I make mistakes, and I get back up and dust myself off and try again.
I had a visual of you doing Aikido there with those various different energies coming at you with your basket weaving analogy. Like almost every single one of those things is a thread that needs your
Yeah,
attention, and you've got to
yeah,
decide exactly how to dance with it. So
exactly.
I'd love you to talk about your what you describe as your moonshot around male mortality.
Yeah, this is but it started with actually about 20 years ago. I read a research by a colleague who had been interested in studying mortality and lifespan in different countries and different cultures throughout the world. And what they found was not surprising, but was, you know, fairly shocking at the time, 20 years ago, was that in every culture and country they studied, they found that as a group, men died sooner, died younger age, and died from various illnesses at rates higher than females. So, summary, men lived shorter and died sooner than women as a group. And what they said, which was, I think, even more uh, a call to action for me, was that they said if you could simply help men live as long as women. Now, there's some biological constraints that maybe we can't do it completely, but we know a lot of the differences, lifestyle, mindset, and so on.
Right.
And countries like we call the blue zones that have learned that very long lived people, and there are places where men actually live as long as women. And if you could do that, the study said you would save 375,000 men's lives every year in the United States alone. And that if you could do that, because it's worldwide, said you do more good in the world than curing cancer. So
Wow.
20 years ago, I reoriented my own work at Men Alive to take into account what we already knew about depression and suicides and violence, and what we already knew we could do to help men. And that helped. But I realized I was just one organization. And so 5 years ago, I invited a number of colleagues who were doing, I thought, really excellent work in the area of men's health to join me in what I called a moonshot for mankind and humanity. And the idea was to bring together our organizations to share knowledge about how we can heal, to share that with other people. And eventually, the goal was to bring together 1,000 organizations that were doing really good work who could help 1 million men to live healthier lives. And that would be not only good for men, but good for women and children and humanity. So we now have a website that's called Moonshot for Mankind, all spelled out,
Hmm.
.org, moonshotformankind.org. And we're just now starting later this year and into next year to starting to spread the word now that we're up and running in a nonprofit and people can donate money, and we're getting a little structure together and some staff to be able to put out information that's helpful, to introduce other organizations beyond the seven core organizations that I started with, and eventually, hopefully, I have no doubt there's 1,000 at least really good organizations all over the world that have as part of their goal to focus their attention on healing men and the unique part of humanity that is mankind. And that would be something that would benefit humanity as well. So that's in a nutshell the moonshot for mankind.
So beautiful. Wow. I didn't find that in preparing for this, but it feels like something that I really would love to be supportive of. What's the requirement for bringing 1,000 organizations together? What is the prerequisite for being part of this movement to support this moonshot? I love it, by the way.
Yeah, well, thank you. So it started out just kind of word of mouth, where people would contact me, and or the other founding members said, "Great, join." And so we've told our friends and colleagues, and so there really isn't a formal requirement. There is, if you go to the website, it shares. There's a little video that shares our mission and our vision, and if it resonates with you as an organization, you can join. It's free. There's a pledge that individuals can take that basically says, if I'm a man, I will do everything I can to help and improve my own health so I'm as healthy in body, mind, and spirit as I can. If you're a woman, some of the founding members are women, so it's they have some women that are working on with improving men's lives, and obviously all of us men have women in our lives. So individual women can take the pledge and say, yeah, I in my work with men, I will do everything I can to support the health and well-being of men as well as myself. So it's a fairly easy organization to join if it resonates with you, and hopefully it will eventually spread the word, and we'll be able to get 1,000 and more organizations that go, yeah, let's get to know each other. Let's hear what each other's doing. Let's, share best practices, kind of like what we're doing here. That, well, here's what I've learned. See if it works for you, and share what we know with each other.
This touches on such a core theme, which has been part of my healing journey, which is sort of the immature masculine of recognizing that the world is always in competition with each other as opposed to being in collaboration. And as over the last few years, I've noticed, when I started doing men's work, there was a shift in my world, which was like when I was in my advertising life, 15 years ago. If I met someone called Jed Diamond who was also doing advertising, we were fighting against one another for the same client, and there was this continual competition. And I've, yeah, managed to heal that part of myself and recognize that what you're doing, this sort of collaboration, is so much more powerful because fuck, we don't need to go and learn this stuff on our own and work in isolation and figure it out. We're much stronger when we come together and share the mission. And it's anchored more in this space that there's more than enough for all of us. And in fact, the collaboration is not only easier, but it's more fun. The results are probably exponential. And yeah, I'm just so grateful to hear that you're doing that.
Yeah, well, I don't, like many of us, when I grew up, they had heroes of the screen who, one of them was the Lone Ranger when I grew up, and it was,
Yes.
the Cowboy West, the lone rider that would go out and, and get the bad guys, and, uh, or the idea of the lone wolf that would be except in nature, there is no such thing as a lone wolf in nature. In
Mm.
nature, wolves work together, and
Yeah.
and they're part of a pack, and they're part of a tribe, and the the nature of males that we've been taught, some of us over some time, to be competitive. And as you described, if you got somebody that's working in your field, you want to learn what you can from them so you can do better than them, or you can beat them out for whatever the goal is, the better job, the more money, the cuter girl, what the relationship, whatever the prize is. And instead, we learn, and part of the moonshot is, hey, we can't do it really good alone. If we ever believed that, it ain't going to work. There's plenty for everybody. We'll do much better if we share our learnings, to share our what we know, and that's what I've been doing in my life for the last 50 some odd years, is share what I know on my website and the work that I do, and then I gain a lot from what other people share with me, and fortunately, if we do that, I make a great living. Other people can make a great living. We can all do good by doing well and helping each other.
So good. It's like the analogy of being alone on my journey, and then sort of, I'm going to do men's work. But then if you go into a container and then decide that your business is now again in isolation, you're disconnecting again. And if you go into competition, you go back into what you spoke about earlier, which is that sort of dominance or power over my environment, like trying to control nature. So yeah, that feels amazing. I would love to ask you a question around switching seats. If you were sitting in my chair, I'm 45 this year. What advice do you give your 45-year-old self that's on this journey with the experience that you have of looking back?
Well, I have occasion, I have children that are that age and older. So when they ask, the truth is, you've had this experience. If they're your kids, they tend not to ask you, although they do a fair amount. But to my 45-year-old self, who I remember quite well, what I would say is kind of what we've been saying, is recognize that the way to have everything you want is through connection, through collaboration, through recognizing, and is that it's in the nature of life to connect. It's in the nature of men to be connecting. We do compete. Competition is part of the natural world, but so is cooperation. And at core, we cooperate in order to live. We connect deeply. Somebody said the the smallest number that exists is two, that one doesn't exist. I think the sensibility of, there is no sense of an individual really separate from others. And if we could teach that one thing to my 45-year-old self, or my 21-year-old self, or at any earlier age, it would be, recognize that desire that you have for connection and collaboration. And the second thing I think that I would say to that 45-year-old self is, the reason we don't always feel it is because somewhere in our lives we grew up where we didn't feel connected. Some because, in my case, I had an absent father, which many of us have. Some because, in some sense, we grew up, as most of us did, in some variation of a dominator culture where we were disconnected. So the fact that we feel somehow at competition and we need to fight others is not a part of who we are. It's a part of the woundedness and the trauma that is part of our early life. So, second kind of thing I would say is, be willing to look back at the trauma, the stories that we told because of the losses that we had, that we denied but never dealt with.
So good. Let's take that a little further. How do you do that? If someone's listening to this, they're like, how would they reflect? Is it like, okay, I've got an absent dad, that's the wound. Like, do you have some questions or something that somebody could perhaps journal on as a way to get to this? Because I think you're touching on something really important. And if there
Yeah,
was a way for
well,
someone listening just to find maybe some key that could support them in
sure.
this.
Well, there, remember back somewhere in earlier in our interview, I said the way I've sorted a lot of this out is I write books. And so I don't have the answers to everything, but I have what I've learned. So for instance, in the book that I wrote, My Distant Dad, Healing the Family Father Wound, when I finished the book, which was the questions I asked myself to sort out my own father wound.
Yeah.
My actually the publisher said, "So what do you want to do next?" They're always, "Well, what's your next?" And I said, "Really, I don't want to write the next book. What I really would like to do is to write a guided uh, manual, a workbook where people who didn't have the time to spend 50 years working through your father wound could be guided by here's the questions I learned and needed to ask myself. So I wrote a workbook that people can get. Uh, and again, if you email me or go to my site, there you can find it. It's not as easy to find because the publisher was on that one a small publisher, but there is, and I can get people that 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 guided questions that you can do on your own. And I have a course online where it takes you through all of those things so you can do your own, healing journey on your own by yourself, or you can come and do therapy with me and I take you through that and, in a healing journey if people want individual guidance, but you can do it on your own with some help from your own inner guides if you'd like.
I'm so glad I asked that because that sounds like exactly the way to do it. To actually just have those questions that you've already worked through. What's the name of that book? You didn't say. You said it was a workbook, but has it have a title?
Yeah, it's called, let's see if I've got a copy I could hold up. Um, no, it's not within. Yeah, it's not within reach. But um, if it basically the workbook for healing the family father wound.
Okay, so it's
Um,
an accompanying workbook that goes with the distant
yeah, it's
dad
a
book that
company.
you
Yeah,
wrote. Got
it's
it.
and again, if people have trouble finding it, they can email me and I can tell them both where you can get it and where on my website. Uh, there's a course that you take that has basically the
Beautiful.
workbook is a course that you can take, or you could just buy the workbook and do it yourself that way. There's a number of ways I take people through that. And I have other books that take you through different avenues of interest of healing. So I try to
Beautiful.
make what I do available so people can do their own journeying.
Great. Shannon, who works with us, will find that for sure and put it in the show notes. So we'll make sure that that's linked up in the show notes if
Super.
you're listening to this. Yeah, thank you. Which has been the most challenging book to write, or which has been the book that you've grown the most from doing? 17 books. I'm sure there's each one brings a different, must be like having 17 children, I guess. What does each one bring? Like what's been
Yeah.
the one that's got the most juice? I mean, it's maybe a difficult question, but I'd love to
Well,
hear you explain it.
as you suggest, it would be like asking which of your children, do you love the most, or which one is the juiciest, which one, and the truth is, they're all different. I mean, that's a cliche, but it's true. And what I can tell you is that the books come when I've needed to sort through some things. So, you know, when I was having relationship issues, I wrote, and worked through them. I wrote the book on relationships that looked at the 5 stages of love that I went through. When I was dealing with the father wound, I wrote that. When I was going through male menopause and my midlife, in my 40s, and where you are, I wrote a book called Male Menopause, that looked at the hormonal and other changes. So, you know, I mean, the good news for the kind of books I write is they speak to different stages of my life, which is not that everybody would go through the same stages, but there's some fairly universal things that we all go through. So most of my books, people tell me, "Oh, that was really helpful when I was going through that," or "This was really helpful," and yeah, I get that that was really helpful at that, um, and people also ask me, "Oh, here I'm going through this. Which book would you recommend, or which article, or which course?" And I'm happy to to share with you whatever additional information would be helpful to help guide you. Because, I mean, the truth is, I love what I do. It's back to where we started. I made a commitment to my children, basically, to be a different kind of man, a different kind of father than my father was able to be. And I got the opportunity to heal my own relationship with my father before he died, and part of my commitment to the future generations, my own children, grandchildren, and great grandchildren, and you all who are watching this are not my direct children, but I'm here for you. You're
Mm.
my whoever finds me, whoever listens to a podcast that I've done and feels my heart says, I care about you. I want the best for you. I want to share whatever I've learned, because at a certain age, and we'll all have some part of that legacy, is we need and want to pass on what we have learned. And we've all got something to pass on, whatever age we are. Because you're 45, you've already learned some things. You learned some things when you're 21 that you could pass on. And I work with some organizations that look at intergenerational healing. And so, the 21-year-olds pass it on to the 10-year-olds, and the 40-year-olds pass it on to 21-year-olds, the 60s pass it on to the 40s, and I'm 80, I pass it on to everybody who's younger than me. Is It's part of my passing on lineage. And then I've got some guys that are older than me that I learned from.
Mm. So good. As a function of where I'm at in my life, and because you literally wrote the book on it, I would love you to share something that's not very often spoken about, which is male menopause. What came from that for you? Like both having done the research for the book, but also as a lived experience. What is it, and why aren't we talking about this?
Well, yeah, I mean that could be another whole podcast, but uh, what it came to me, as many things do, from women. I had a number of women, including my wife at the time, who was going through menopause, change of life, and it was a pain in the ass. It was hard. She was cranky. She had all kinds of stuff, and as she kind of got through it, uh, she said, I think you're going through something. And I was like, what are you talking about? Men don't go through. But I because I'm an author, and anytime I hear, well, maybe that maybe I ought to check that out. So I did research, and I found out that men go through their own change of life that's different, but has some similarities. And then I wrote the book called Male Menopause, and it became an international bestseller. You can't see over my shoulders. You see some books, but up above where you can't see are the I think 18 foreign translations of male menopause that have now been translated into almost every language you could think of, from Chinese to Hebrew to Spanish and Dutch. And so it's very real. It's different from women, but there's many similarities. It happens to men between 40 and 55, although it can start as early as 35 or as late as 65. It has a hormonal component, but is related to psychological, interpersonal, and other relational issues. And we all go through it, and we all can benefit from what we can learn to modulate our hormones, change the way we relate to ourselves and our loved ones. And there's a reason why a lot of people have been reading it, and it gets rediscovered 10 or 15 years, some people go, I didn't know that. Tell me about it. So the fact that you're asking tells me you're probably going to be checking it out and letting others know, hey, there's this book that Jed or other people wrote that might be of interest.
Mhm. I love that every question I ask you literally written the book on it. That feels amazing. Like you just generally have been through all of these initiatory phases, and the nature of your being is that you write about it. So I think that's super magical. Thank you for sharing that, because it does give the ability for other people to learn from these experiences that you've been through. But what are some of the things that people could do in their lives if they're feeling this andropause coming into their experience? What are some of the things that support men as they go through this initiation in this age of their life?
Well, one of the things I say is to get your testosterone levels checked. I've told this to
Okay.
my son and most guys don't know what their testosterone levels are. They don't know the difference between total testosterone and bioavailable testosterone. So there's
Hmm.
things you can learn, and
Yeah.
then things you can do based on what you know that can help you find out. I have a questionnaire that like I've got that's in the book, as well as
Uh-huh.
on my website, that says here are the questions you should be asking yourself to see if you have male menopause, and here are the things that you probably need to explore to see whether you need to do. And then there's a whole lot of things you can do that have to do with your hormones, have to do with your diet, have to do with your exercise, have to do with your relationships, that can then help you in areas where you uniquely may be having some challenges.
Hmm. Brilliant. And the book is called Male Menopause, just straight
Yeah,
like
there's
that.
actually two of them. The first one is called Male Menopause, and the second one is called Surviving Male Menopause: A Guide for Women and Men. After male menopause came out, a lot of women were going, "Oh God, I need I need to understand what he's going through." So I wrote the book for women as well as people in relationships. So yeah, there's two books: Male Menopause, Surviving Male Menopause. And then there's a third book that's called The Whole Man Program, that's for men over 40, that tells you here's what you can do if you're going through this. So there's a lot of resource in the books and in articles and classes and other things that I do.
Hmm. Quick question on female menopause. What is your suggestion for supporting men who are showing up for their partners as they go through the female initiation of perimenopause and that dance? I'm in that right now, and I noticed what you said as well was like I was just nodding my head, sort of cranky, irritable, and she's
Yeah.
not doing it on purpose. I know my partner loves me, and she's just going through this tough initiation
Yeah.
with her body and her own hormones. And then maybe you could also link that back to your current role of showing up as caretaking a partner who is unwell. I know you spoke about that in your relationship. That's been a
Mhm.
theme for me. How do you balance, well, some support on what that looks like, but also how do you balance the role of showing up as a caretaker while not going into rescue, or something about that, those two polarities?
Yeah. Well, that was again a lot that's there, and I'm feeling, almost like we need another session. As I said when we talked, I've have a bit of a cold, so I'm reaching the end of my
Yeah.
my talking area. But so let me just say a couple of things, and then maybe we can wrap it up. And I'm happy to talk more at another time. But in terms of the women in our lives who are going through, um, is I think we all have a general idea that women, at a certain age start having a drop of their hormones. And for women, which is one of the differences for men, they reach a point where they gradually, over a number of years, um, have a loss of the ability of the eggs to be viable, and so they can no longer have babies. And then there's a whole lot of physical, emotional, hormonal, and feeling changes that go on over a period of many years that are can be challenging. most women know more about what to do, and there's lots of books and articles and magazine
Yes.
things. Mostly, there's not a lot for men to help them understand what women are going through. So um, listen to your woman. Let her guide you. Uh, Let her suggest some things maybe she'd like you to read to get you up to date, and just know, just as you said, it's a I mean, the way I think of it, and it can be helpful, is most people understand what it's like to go through puberty, and your hormones are going, and you're cranky, and you're angry, and because you've been through something like that yourself. And if you have children, you then know that your children go through that. Well, menopause in some way is like puberty in reverse. Your hormones were coming online. Now your hormones are going offline, and some of the same turmoil is going on both ways. So, and there's similarities for men and women there. But when you're dealing with the women, you need to be caring, just like you would with your teenagers. You need to be sensitive. At the other end of the scale, when you're taking care of people who, in my wife's case, who's getting, needing care. And there's some similarities with going through menopause or any kind of fairly, you need to take care of yourself. You need to say, I'm here for you now, and now I need to get away. I need a rest, or I need to go take care of me, or God, I've been helping you. And so there's a balance always in any relationship of taking care of yourself, taking care of the other, taking care of the different strands of your work. So it requires, in my case, having a men's group for support, having friends, doing therapy, going for walks. I have my own kind of things that I've developed that work for me. And then I'm always going, well, maybe I need something new. I'm running up against something that I haven't dealt with, and I need some new skills, some new ideas. So I'm always curious to understand rather than judge, which is part of what I think is helpful with dealing with our wives, dealing with ourselves, and dealing with others. So hopefully that that helps for now.
Yeah, it's again your basket analogy, just checking which strand is alive at the moment and recognizing if it's my work to do, if it's center myself versus showing up for my partner or go for a walk. So yeah, beautiful. Thank you so much for taking the time
Sure.
to show up. All the work that you've done, it feels amazing to be following in your footsteps. And thank you for being a pioneer in this field. Where can people connect with you and find out about your work? We'll put it in the show notes, but I'd love you just to speak a little bit about where they can connect
Sure.
with you.
The easy way, is kind of my window to the world, is menalive.com, just spelled out menalive.com. I have a free newsletter that goes out to anybody that signs up if you want to be in touch with me, and my articles that go out. And there's a lot of, things on the site that you can help. And I'm a real person. I'm a real guy. I try to answer all the emails that come, and if I get a whole lot at one time, it takes a little longer. But I'm accessible.
You are indeed. Thank you so much. Jed, is there anything you'd like to leave with our audience before we sign out? Maybe just a parting shot or a North Star or something that you think would be beneficial for someone listening to this?
Yeah, I just would just recognize that there are so many strands of the men's work that now are available. And, I was saying to you that I didn't know what your work was. And clearly you've been doing some significant work for a while. So I just want to acknowledge the work that you're doing, the younger people that are here that came after me, and that we really have a lot to learn from each other and a lot to give to each other. So whatever part of this you're connected with, who are watching this or hearing about it, just get curious, reach out. There's so much good things happening now that weren't available when I was starting out. So I'm looking forward to more connections with you and more connections with your audience as time goes on.
Beautiful. I definitely feel like this is not the last time we're going to be in each other's space. So, yeah, thanks again for taking the time. It's been a really beautiful first conversation. And yeah, thanks again for being alive, brother. Much love.
You too, my friend.
Cheers.